when we're first pregnant, we all think that we're going to get to, 40 weeks, we're going to deliver by the light of the moon, and it's going to be this beautiful romantic delivery, and everything's going to be perfect, and there's going to be wood nymphs and all this kind of stuff dancing. And well, I live in Northern California, so it's a little bit of a different perspective there. But we all have an idea in our head about what a perfect delivery is, and nobody's idea of a perfect delivery is having their baby in the intensive care unit. And so when we have this degree of emotional distress, our stress hormone response really kind of kicks into high gear. This is really sort of almost like our flight and fight response is really just going all the time. And what happens is these stress hormones affect our immune system and how our body actually repairs itself, how it responds to outside influences, how it heals itself. And we know that this also affects inflammation. And this is also very important in recovering from infection. And there are very, very good studies that show that people who are significantly stressed or significantly depressed actually have worse outcomes with many different medical conditions. There are studies with breast cancer patients, there are studies with vaccine responses, really all across the medical field that we know that when people are stressed or depressed or have anxiety, that they're not going to do as well as people who are coping better with the situation. And so really thinking about how can we harness this, because we're in a situation of the highest possible stress, and we need to figure out how we can kind of mitigate this to really do, because this is really one of the few things we can do for our children, especially when they're in the hospital. We trust nurses and physicians to take care of them. We can't work their ventilators. We can't give them their medications. A lot of times we can't even hold them, but what we can do is actually put ourselves in the best possible situation to interact and react with our children to try to help as much as possible to mitigate any of the effects of stress on them. So one of the other consequences of having this degree of emotional distress, this roller coaster ride, not only in the hospital but for years to come, is depression. We know that postpartum depression affects up to 20% of women who deliver at term and also 10% of fathers. We don't want to neglect the dads here too. That can also be a significant thing. And about 40% of mothers with a premature delivery will suffer from postpartum depression. And this is very important because when moms are depressed and dads are depressed, that affects the way they're able to actually interact with their children. And you have to remember that babies and children, as they grow, they learn by modeling us. They learn by watching our faces. They learn by interacting with us. And if we are depressed or stressed, we're giving a different interaction for them. And that actually changes how their nervous system develops. There's really very fascinating studies looking at CT scans of brains and MRIs at brain development when babies are exposed to more of a high-stress parental response versus a lower stress response. The other thing that's really just kind of come to light, I think, recently is post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the essential feature of that and what we need to know is that it's being haunted by a terrible experience. And I think most of us can agree here that there really isn't anything more terrible than having your baby in the intensive care unit. That's about one of the worst possible things, although I take that back. The worst thing is having your baby die, and I unfortunately know that as well. But, you know, the intensive care unit is pretty much a close second. And for a lot of situations, it's almost worse because it's an ongoing trauma. It's, you know, day after day of what are you going to find when you wake up? Are you going to get that dreaded phone call? And so that's really part of post-traumatic stress disorder, is that continuing exposure to a traumatic event, which can then lead to bad memories and flashbacks, nightmares. For me, I sort of had an ongoing loop of actually seeing my son die in my head. That went on over and over and over again. And I thought that was completely normal. I thought that's just what happened, because I actually never really knew anybody who passed away before, I mean, patients, but, you know, everybody in my family lives forever. So they get crazy at the end, though. So there's a lot of 95-year-olds who are really cranky, but they live forever. And I was told my grandfather was shot twice in the First World War. He started smoking when he was 8, and he lived to be 99. So, you know, we're made of tough stuff. But so understanding that post-traumatic stress disorder affects, as Kelly mentioned, 76% of mothers in the intensive care unit, and also a significant percentage of fathers. And I think one of the most important things to recognize about that is not that there's anything bad about it. That's actually a normal response to an abnormal situation. And I think that, you know, we do enough blaming ourselves, which we shouldn't do, because blame doesn't get you anywhere, and to really understand that it's a normal response and that there are things that can be done. And one of the best things that can be done is actually leaning on somebody, such as an organization like Hand to Hold. And I want to just read a little excerpt from my book at this point, just to sort of, you know, which talks a little bit about my experiences actually with post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is in the chapter on emotional health. I was the queen of avoiding triggers. I refused to sign up for the Mothers of Multiples Club because I couldn't bear the thought of seeing triplets. I hated being around strangers because inevitably someone would approach cooing, "What beautiful twins." I was always flummoxed, or I respond, "Actually, they're triplets," and bear the pain of the explanation for a stranger who didn't really want to know. Do I respond with the appropriate niceties and say, "Yes, they're twins," letting the wound rip open again and fester once more? Sometimes I could avoid it with a simple nod. However, there was always a follow-up question, like a 1-2 punch in the boxer's ring. Who is the eldest? I wanted to shout, "Neither," but usually I would lie and point to Oliver. Then my mother-in-law came to visit. She'd lost her middle child, my husband's younger brother, David, when he was 15. When a neighbor of ours asked her how many children she had, without batting an eye, she answered, 4 who are with me and 1 who is in heaven. I was astounded and so proud of her at the same time. So I started the same approach. When people asked if my boys were twins, I responded, "No, they're triplets," but their oldest brother did not come home from the hospital. Sometimes it was clear they didn't really want to hear it, but I didn't care. I needed to say it. I had to hear it, accept it, and deal with it. Gradually, being around people and answering questions became easier and easier, but I still avoided triplets. Then some years later, I came face to face with an unexpected set. Triplet ogres at the end of Shrek the Third. And much to my surprise, I laughed just like everybody else. So that was my I actually didn't even realize that I had post-traumatic stress disorder until I actually wrote the book and I was researching it. And what's even really funny about it is my best friend's husband is one of the national experts on PTSD in Canada. He works with all the wounded soldiers coming back from war, and I thought, well, isn't this ironic? So of course I called him up and I talked to him about it. He goes, "Well, of course you have PTSD. I've known that for years." I'm like, "Well, why didn't you say anything to me?" He said, "Well, I'm not your doctor." I'm like, "Oh, great." So anyway. But I just think it's really important to not blame ourselves, to understand that these are normal responses and that there's help out there. And that's really one of the most important, I think, take-home messages from the whole PTSD aspect of things. The other problem with having and people wonder, how is it so high in that neonatal intensive care unit? 76% of people with PTSD, I mean, that's approaching the kind of levels that you see with people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. But when people question it, I say, you don't know what happens in the NICU, do you? So you're witnessing a traumatic event over and over and over again. You have some of the same things that happen to soldiers. You're powerless to do anything about it. You feel ashamed because maybe it was your fault, even though it's not really, but we all think that. You feel guilty. You have all of these same things, and when you want to talk to someone about it, your friends don't really want to hear. I mean, they sort of do superficially, but nobody really wants to listen to you talking about it over and over and over again, because people who don't have premature babies don't really think that it could be that bad, that it could go on for that long. Oh, please, it's not over already?